Thank you for joining us today. Thanks to everyone for tuning in around the world. This is Insightful Leader Live. I'm Jess Love, Editor-in-Chief of Kellogg Insight and host of our podcast, The Insightful Leader. We actually have two new webinars scheduled for the month of May, one with Craig Garthwaite, who will take us through the crazy, wild, expensive, and complicated system that we call American healthcare. And we will also be hearing from Professors Laura Nordgren and David Schoenthal, who will be talking about why people are resistant to change and how to innovate anyway. Today, of course, a topic that is incredibly timely, business and activism. Before we get started, some housekeeping. Right now, everyone is using the chat function to communicate. You're telling us where you're from, which is fantastic to see. We are going to be turning that off shortly, so your messages are only going to go to those of us behind the scenes. So use that for any tech issues that come up. Today's session will begin with a presentation, and then we'll move on to Q&A. So if you have questions for our professor today, you can type those in the Q&A box, and we'll see how many we can get to. Finally, this event will be recorded. Everyone who registers will get a link to a video of this presentation. Without further ado, activists are increasingly calling upon businesses to respond to a wide range of social and political issues. Racial justice, LGBTQ, voting, income inequality, abortion, immigration, guns, of course it being Earth Day, climate change, and many more. With an incredibly divided population, especially here in the US, the stakes for organizations and for communities are really high. That is why we are so lucky to be hearing from one of the world's leading experts in corporate social responsibility and activism, Brayden King. Brayden King is a professor and chair of Kellogg's Management and Organizations Department. He's published dozens of research articles on social movements, corporate responses, and policymaking. He's regularly cited in top media outlets such as the New York Times, Chicago Tribune, The Atlantic, Wall Street Journal, Financial Times. And he's going to talk about when activism succeeds, when it fails, and how activists and corporations can coexist or even collaborate. So thank you so much, and I'm going to turn it over to you, Brayden.
Thank you, Jess. Let me just pull up my slides here. I'm very excited to be here today and have this opportunity to share some of my research with all of you, as well as to engage in some conversation via the Q&A. I also want to start off by just expressing my gratitude to be a part of the Kellogg community and to the Kellogg School of Management, which facilitates this kind of research. I appreciate being a part of a community where we are encouraged to follow the knowledge where it may lead us, wherever that may be. So today I'm going to present some of that to you. This is a lot of research that I've been engaged in since I've been here at Kellogg for the last 13 years. And I'm going to focus in on kind of questions around how social and political activism influences their intended targets. So as Jess mentioned at the beginning, this is a timely topic, but it's also one I think that has resonated throughout the last half a century or so, as we look at many of the big social or political changes that have occurred in our society over the last 50, 60 years. It's hard to imagine that many of them would have occurred if it hadn't been for people engaging in social movements, or as I like to think of them, collective action that people purposefully use to try to pursue change. And oftentimes that collective action is expressed through protests or marches or boycotts or other forms of action where you get the attention of the public and try to pressure your targets to change some of their rules, their laws, their policies. One of the most iconic social movements, of course, is the American Civil Rights Movement, which has really left a large footprint. We see it today in the Black Lives Matter movement. But also you see the echoes of it in terms of the kinds of tactics used in the environmental movement, in the LGBTQ movement, as well as in many of the movements we see on our college campuses and workplaces today. And you can see that you just have to turn on the news to recognize that the public cares about these movements, and increasingly their targets are engaged with them as well. One of my favorite photos of an activist is this one that you see on the slide up in the upper right corner. Here you see people taking time off work in the late 1950s to boycott and protest outside of a store that was engaging in racially discriminatory practices. They clearly were there because they cared about this. This was an ideal that mattered to them a lot. And it was because of people like this that I became interested in this research. I wanted to study how people who have important ideals that are important to them carry out those ideals through action. And then I wanted to see how that mattered. Does it lead to any kinds of consequences? So sort of a modern expression of this would be in the lower left-hand corner. Here you see some activists who are sitting in kayaks. These are environmental activists who are putting themselves in front of an oil rig to try to prevent it from doing its job. And they call themselves kayaktivists. So clearly, these tactics, protests are used today to try to stir change in some way. And of course, we're living through a momentous time, one in which you see people mobilized to take action in both, from along the political spectrum. So it's not just people in the progressive left who are engaging in activism, but increasingly you see people in the right side, the right side of the political spectrum as well, engaging in collective action. And of course, the conflict between the two leads to what we think of as a lot of political uncertainty and upheaval in our current society. And so one of the questions I'm increasingly interested in is, how does this affect companies that are trying to position themselves in a society where political opinions are increasingly polarized? So one of the tactics I'm most interested in has been protest. And we're going to start a poll. And the poll is a question of how many of you have engaged at some time in in your lifetimes in a kind of political or social protest. I'm interested to see how the numbers compare to the averages in the United States and the world. So why do people engage in protest? Well, one reason is because, and this is again looking at from the activist perspective, because they see it as a way to express their voice. It's a part of how we engage in politics in a democratic society. When there's something happening that you dislike and you don't have the means to express it otherwise, you can take to the streets, express your discontent, and you hope that somebody in a position of power listens to you. Another reason related to this is that they see it as a means to disrupt existing power relations. So if you consider that, the people who are sitting in legislatures or at the top of, a corporate board are the ones making the decisions, most people don't have access to those people. They're not in a position where they can, call them up and tell them what they want, or they're afraid that they wouldn't listen to them even if they could. And so protests are a means to kind of shift the balance of power more to the normal everyday person. And that's related to this third reason, which is that they want access. They want their voice to be heard in these arenas that are otherwise closed to them. And then a fourth reason is that they're looking for allies. They're trying to reach out and really go to the hearts of people who are sitting in their homes across the country or world, who may be sympathetic to their views, but who haven't aren't necessarily engaged actively in their cause. So they're trying to create sympathetic allies from people, and they do that by kind of engaging in protest, getting broadcast on television or in the media in some other way, and then changing their views on something. So it looks like we have a pretty active, based on the poll results that are coming in, we have a very politically active group here. 49% of you have at some point participated in a protest. 51% say no. That is above the average. The average in the United States over the last 20 or 30 years has been closer to 30%. So I would say this is an above average politically active group here. So the question that, even if I think many of us ask, even if you are politically active in a movement, is, are protests effective at what they intend to do? And the answer is yes, in the sense that we can just look at history and see how policy issues have changed in response to movements. And if you look at one particular kind of protest tactic, the boycott, then it's a clear yes. Boycotts, based on some research I've done, tend to get some form of concession about 25% of the time, as long as you're getting some kind of national media coverage. That doesn't mean every boycott that someone dreams up in their house is going to get media attention, but those that are able to garner some media attention, about 25% of them get concessions from their target. And boycott, this also begs, the question of what is a protest? I think a protest is any kind of public act that involves more than one person, where people are trying to disrupt or create an intended sort of change. And so a boycott counts as a protest according to that definition. So what are the reasons for their effectiveness? So I'm first going to start off with some reasons why they're not effective. That is, these are not good explanations for effectiveness. And I'll start with the boycott because it is a common kind of tactical effort that activists use. And there's a sort of a theory that boycotts are effective because they convince consumers to change their behavior. And if you can convince consumers to stop shopping at a store or to stop buying a product, that will affect sales revenue, and that puts pressure on a company to change. But in reality, there's very little evidence that boycotts affect a change in sales revenue. And if you kind of zoom in and look at consumers' micro behavior, there's also very little evidence that consumers change their behavior. Even when they publicly support a boycott, they're not often changing their behavior. So we can't necessarily attribute the effectiveness of a boycott or a protest to the influence it has over consumers. Similarly, they tend not to materially disrupt the organizations they're going after. Even though the Kai activists are annoying to the oil company, they're not really, putting a dent into their ability to do their jobs. When they do have a kind of materially disruptive effect, as you would see when environmentalists have tried to sabotage efforts of deforesting or something like that, the disruption tends to be very small and minimal and in a short time span. And so you don't see a long-term disruption of these organizations. And you also don't tend to see a takeover of power relations, even though oftentimes it's stated that a protest is done to change the balance of power. It's not usually the case that you see a massive disruption of a hierarchy of an organization or of a legislature or of the legal branch or any other targets because protests are happening. So if these are not good explanations, I guess the next question would be, why then do organizational or political decision makers listen to activists? If it's not for these reasons, what are the reasons for this? I'm going to focus on a few mechanisms. And the first one is that protests generate information. That is, you can think of protests as a kind of information signal that causes people to pay attention to an issue or maybe rethink an issue in a way they hadn't before. So when protesters show up and they're protesting against a company because they dislike the organization's environmental practices, it causes investors, policymakers, executives, and the general public to look at that organization in a different way. In a sense, it kind of lays bare a negative aspect of that company's behavior that people hadn't noticed before. And so inasmuch as protests are kind of information generators, you can see, or you would expect, that protests are most effective when there was less access to past information about an organization or a topic. And that's definitely the case. So when protests happen against a company, they tend to be more informative if the company has been less covered by the media in the past. I'll give you an example of how that works in a few minutes. So protests, in a sense, kind of by giving an information signal, help shape the agenda of which issues matter, which issues will decision makers talk about. Early on in my career, I did some research on this, looking at how Congress was affected, how the Congress's agenda was affected by protesters. And in this research, we looked at a variety of kinds of protests, all related to rights, human rights. And we looked at whether there were protests that occurred in the previous year and whether the number of protests that occurred were more than the average number of protests for any other issue. So that is that in order to provide a good information signal, protesters needed to be louder than their peer protesters. They had to kind of compete for attention among the various kinds of movements out there. And we found that when they did make more noise, or they were able to generate more attention and shape the agenda of Congress by causing them to have more hearings related to that issue in the following year. So protests also have an effect on companies in the same way. They draw investors' attention to potential problems within a company. And we found that this had a direct impact on how investors viewed the value or the stock price of a company over a 26-day period. So when a protest happened, on average, there tended to be a 1% decline in the expected returns of that company over that 26-day period. Now, there was variation in that result. So companies that had been covered a lot by the media prior to the protest didn't have that same kind of stock price decline. And we theorize that that's because those companies already had a lot of information out there about them, and investors weren't learning a lot new because the protest occurred. So protests tend to be more informative, the less that investors or analysts or anybody else knows about what's going on inside the company. The second mechanism, which is related, is that they create a reputational threat against the company. So protests create negative, unwanted attention to a company, and they threaten to undermine this cultivated image or brand that a company is trying to create. And companies, not just companies, politicians as well, but they all care about their reputations. There are long-term benefits that are associated with having a positive reputation, including creating more employee morale. It helps the workplace culture. It helps establish a brand that has long-term value. So social movements, in as much as they can change public opinion by providing new negative information about a company, can potentially threaten these long-term assets that the company has built through its reputation. So when a company gets boycotted, for example, they're most susceptible to the boycott when there's a lot of media attention about that boycott. In a sense, the media facilitates the reputational threat. So boycotts depend greatly on media coverage in order to create this reputational threat that they're trying to pursue. Nike is sort of a classic example of this. Nike was boycotted a lot in the 1990s because they were using, like many companies in their industry at the time, suppliers that used sweatshop labor in their supply chain. And they were boycotted continuously, both by college students as well as other human rights activist groups. And at the time, Nike complained, like, why are you going after us? We're not doing anything differently than any of our competitors are doing. And the answer that activists would give is because people care about Nike because you have a good reputation. So activists actually will go after, they'll target the companies that have the best reputations because they recognize that they're the most susceptible. It turns out, though, that the companies that are even more susceptible are those companies that used to have sterling reputations, but those reputations have been in recent decline because they're especially sensitive to what boycotters are asking them for. It's notable that Nike changed its tune on this and became one of the leaders of their industry, in part because boycotters were pushing them in that direction to improve their labor standards. The third mechanism is risk. That is, by creating new information, protests accentuate perceptions of risk that an organization faces. So investors and especially analysts will take this risk into consideration when they're offering advice about whether this is a good buy or a bad buy. So assessments of value are oftentimes based in the long-term kind of financial risks that companies face. If protesters expose kind of some underlying environmental problems or labor problems that a company is dealing with, then that can accentuate perceptions of risk. And in one study that Bodhi Vasi from the University of Iowa and I did, we found that in as much as protests and environmental shareholders were jointly kind of targeting a company, this created perceptions of environmental risk by third-party auditors. And a consequence of that was that it led to longer-term declines in a company's net present value. So these are the three main mechanisms. And I want to note that these are all kind of in conversation with one another, that protests generate this new information. This information helps generate reputational threats and risk perceptions, and those two are interlinked in as much as a threat to a company's reputation can also create some long-term risk for that company in terms of its ability to create value. So what do organizations do to respond to activists and to these mechanisms of reputational threat and risk perceptions? Well, there are 5 main common responses, and I want to talk about them in order of the sort of the least meaningful to the more meaningful. And what I mean by meaningfulness here is that least meaningful responses are those where that are easy to do. That is, it's less costly for a company to make these kinds of responses, and also they tend to involve less commitment on the company's part. Whereas the more meaningful tend to be higher cost and also more high commitment kinds of responses. So let me start with the first, which is public statements of support. So we're all very familiar with these kinds of statements. In recent years, I should say in the last year, many companies have made statements about racial justice and sometimes explicitly recognizing the role that the Black Lives Matter movement has played in exposing issues around racial justice and police violence. Many of these companies have publicly pledged to address racial injustices in their organization. Not all these commitments or public responses are the same. Target, for example, vowed to give 10,000 hours of consulting to Black-owned businesses in the Twin Cities area. Facebook committed to doubling the number of Black and Latinx employees by 2023. So these are different responses that companies make. I would say that we probably underestimate the number of responses because many of these responses are internal. That is, they're making these responses to their employees and telling them, hey, we're hearing the issues and we're doing something about it. I don't want to minimize public response and say that, or these public statements and say that they're ineffective. I just want to point out that it's easy for a company to say something, to say they're going to do something. It doesn't always mean that they follow through and actually make that commitment. So, why are companies suddenly so responsive to the Black Lives Matter movement? This is obviously a movement that's been going for some time. It dates back to the civil rights movement. It kind of experienced a change in identity around 2015 or so. But it wasn't until around 2019 that you began to see a radical change in public opinion based about Black Lives Matter and racial justice in the United States. This is a graph that was in an article in the New York Times that really nicely shows how the American public's opinion about police deadly force against Black people as compared to white people shifted over this time period. And you see that at the time of the George Floyd murder and the protests that followed that there was a very steep incline in terms of people agreeing with the perspective and goals of the Black Lives Matter movement. And so that shift in opinion changed companies' calculus about how this was going to affect their reputation if they didn't say something and come out in support of racial justice issues inside and outside their company. A second sort of response that companies can make are concessions, and this typically occurs when they're being directly targeted by activists, either through a boycott or a protest or some other sort of tactic. So a concession is when leaders come out and say, we recognize that this is an issue and we're going to give in to a demand that the activists are making. Usually the reason for a concession is because companies are worried about the real reputational threat they're facing. And this threat is associated with higher levels of media attention. So companies are more likely to make concessions when the media attention is of great magnitude and when it's sustained over a longer period of time. I'll give you one example of a concession from my research. Boise Cascade is a company that, one of the things that it does is engages in a lot of timber production, lumber production, and then creates a lot of wood products or provides the supplies for wood products. And they were also known throughout the 1990s as one of the most horrendous companies in terms of their environmental standards. They engaged in a lot of deforestation of ancient forest areas. So this was obviously something that the environmental movement disagreed with. And they engaged in a sustained boycott campaign against Boise Cascade. Eventually, in around 2001 or 2002, Boise Cascade began to make incremental concessions to the movement and announced in 2002 that they would no longer do any forest deforesting in these long-term forests. So this is an example of a company changing its actual mode of production in direct response to what boycotters are asking for. Clearly, Boise Cascade wouldn't have done this if they hadn't received so much negative media attention around the issue. Another kind of response is infrastructural change. What I mean by this is that companies actually change some of the functions of their organization in order to meet to better engage with the various activists who are confronting them. A couple of my colleagues and I wrote an article about this, and we called these infrastructural changes social management devices, which is kind of a jargony way of saying, hey, we're making infrastructural changes so that we can better engage in outreach with activists and foresee and deal with future reputational threats. So two examples that we focused on were developing CSR committees at the board level and then issuing CSR reports. And you may think, well, these seem kind of like low level, like kinds of changes, but the reality is they're not. A CSR committee means you're putting like the highest level of the organization, board members, on a committee that are specifically charged with dealing with these issues and overseeing the reputation and outreach of those company with activists. And a CSR report, is typically of great length. Sometimes these reports, number in the hundreds to up to 1,000 pages. Just to create a CSR report, you have to put together a team of people inside your organization who can gather all that information and assemble it in a transparent way. But the other thing that this infrastructural change does is that it creates champions within the organization, people who are kind of then engaging with these activists on a daily basis, and who often kind of take on the activist point of view and become allies of those activists in the future. So we refer to these kinds of changes as pathways to future stakeholder engagement. This leads to sort of the last way of engaging activists, which is activist engagement. So here it's about actually reaching out to the activists and including them in discussions around future decision making inside your organization. So this is one of the main reasons that activists protest. They feel that their voices aren't heard, and they want to be in the future. They want to have a seat at the table when crucial decisions are being made. This was definitely the case when it comes to the environmental movement. Many young people are getting involved in the environmental movement because they feel like their voices have been muffled in the past. So activist engagement is a much more complex process than simply saying, we hear you, we're making a concession. It means, hey, activists, come talk to us and help us devise better policies and practices. This is an example that comes from a blog post from a former head of sustainability at McDonald's. Here he's talking about his experience with Greenpeace, which is an activist organization that's not known for being kind or necessarily always collaborative with corporations. He said, Greenpeace sent us a fax. This is back a few years. Sent us a fax with a set of demands that made it seem that McDonald's alone could solve the soy expansion into the Amazon biome. Our team thought the proposals were ridiculous rhetoric. I got on the phone with Greenpeace the second day of its campaign and said, we agree with you, but don't agree with your proposed solution. I waited tensely and silently for a long time for its response. I expected they would continue with its rhetoric and campaign. Instead, Greenpeace surprised me by saying it was open to working together. Greenpeace did not see it coming. We understood that McDonald's did not want to expose themselves. Our strategy was to move McDonald's and others would follow their example. That McDonald's would directly help us recruit others was not in our mind. So this was an interaction, a kind of collaboration that surprised both Greenpeace and McDonald's, but created a really fruitful platform for changes in the industry that are still resonating today. So activist engagement is necessary if you want to create meaningful, long-lasting change. The problem with simply making statements or making a public commitment to something is that it doesn't take into account all the difficult, kind of costly measures that need to take place inside the organization if those changes are going to be realized. I'll just give one example here, which is activist efforts to push companies to improve their efforts on consumer safety. One of my co-authors and I found that more companies were willing to make policy statements or public statements about changes in consumer safety than they were to make implementation of those policy changes. And we found that the main reason that they don't move from simply a statement of a policy change to implementation of policy change was because they lacked internal support or internal know-how to make those changes. So you really need champions for the cause within your ranks if you're going to move from a statement to eventual implementation. You see this is the case certainly within efforts to diversify the corporate world. Many of the most common ways that common means that companies use to improve diversity don't work at all. In fact, this is a chart from Frank Dobbin and Alexander Kolev's HBR piece on why diversity programs fail. And they found that the most common diversity enrichment programs actually have the opposite effect in terms of managing diversity. So once companies institute mandatory diversity training, job testing, or grievance systems, you actually tend to see a decline in diversity, not an improvement. The kinds of practices that work, that is, they work in improving diversity, are those practices that engage people throughout, up and down the hierarchy of the organization, and give champions or movement allies a chance to have an influence on the implementation of diversity. So mentoring programs, diversity task forces, mid-level diversity managers have a much more significant improvement on diversity than simply mandates coming from the top. And so this sort of accentuates that point I made earlier, that meaningful change requires supporting and encouraging workplace allies, activist engagement up and down the hierarchy of your organization, whereas simply public statements of support are not going to cut it. Now, I don't want this to be taken the wrong way, which is I don't think the public statements of support are a bad thing. Sometimes you can see incremental changes that begin with public statements of support and that eventually lead to more kinds of long-lasting and more meaningful sorts of change, because companies realize that in order to make these statements of support real, you have to start managing your infrastructure. You have to include the activists at the table. You have to, work to increase the voice of allies within the workplace. So rather than seeing statements of support as bad, I see them merely as kind of the beginning of a process that can eventually lead to meaningful change within a company. And that kind of leads to my final point, which is that one of the reasons why I'm hopeful for the future of our world is because I think that activists increasingly do have a place at the table. We are more likely to listen to them than we were 20 or 30 years ago. We don't just see them as radical kind of peripheral players, but rather we see them as voices that matter, and companies and governments throughout the world are increasingly willing to kind of let them in and have them help set better practices for the future. In as much as that continues, I'm hopeful that our practices will continue to change in line with the kind of visions that activists have for our future. So let me just stop there, and we can now kind of open this up to more of a conversation.
Wonderful. Well, we actually had we've had a lot of great questions come in. So I'm going to start with a little bit of a follow-up to what you were talking about in terms of these making public statements of support. You talked about kind of the benefit and how it shouldn't be thought of as a bad thing for a company to come out with a statement of support because it could be the first step to something bigger. Is there the risk then? We had a question about whether there are risks involved of coming out with a public statement of support but then not following through, or maybe even having parts of your operations or your political actions undermine that statement of support.
Yeah, it's a great question. And what I would say is that there are risks both ways. That is that if companies, so the more pressure that there is on companies by activists to make a statement, then if those companies don't make a statement, they risk sort of alienating those activists and increasing the likelihood they're going to be a continued target of that company. So that's just sort of you're inviting continued unwanted negative media attention. But if you make a sort of a public commitment and then have no idea how you're going to implement, or you have no plan for doing anything about that commitment, that can lead to claims of hypocrisy. In fact, we've seen many examples of this in our research where companies will make a commitment, not do anything about it, and they end up becoming more of a focus of movements in the future than less. So yeah, making a commitment that doesn't have any kind of plan for implementation can lead a company kind of down the road of continued targeting by activists. That's for sure. So I guess I would say that you want to make a statement, but you also want to make sure that you have prepared for a pathway to realize that commitment.
You also talked about the importance of getting your own employees involved in activism. And what obstacles might make it difficult for individuals who want to advocate for changes in their own organizations, and how can they move past those obstacles?
I'm glad you brought this up, because this is one of the issues that I've been really focused on lately. And as we talk to a lot of employees throughout the world, we realize that there are many employees who care about issues. They're even engaged in movements outside of the workplace, but they don't necessarily feel like they have a lot of support within the workplace. One main obstacle is that it's sort of a fear that employees have that if they engage in activism in their workplace, that they could face retribution that can be bad for their career. And sometimes the language, the rhetoric, and also the emotions that movements use are just not super conducive to change within the workplace. So I'll just use the example of anger. Mass movements get a lot out of anger. So when mass movements use anger as kind of a stimulus for getting people involved in the movement, it often works. People show up to a protest because they're angry and they want to do something about it. But that same kind of emotional stimulus has sort of the opposite effect inside the workplace. So when you try to get people to become your ally in the workplace, anger can actually cause them to retreat because they're worried that expressing anger in their workplace will actually cause them to experience these kind of career, threatening retribution and hurt the reputation, et cetera. Basically, anger is just not an emotion we're super comfortable expressing in the workplace. And so, and this is based on a study that Katie DeCellis and Scott Sonnenschein did and published recently. We basically argue that, activists have to figure out a different kind of emotional stimulus other than anger when they're engaging with workplace allies if they want those allies to be, or if they want those employees to be engaged with their cause.
We've got a couple of questions around what to do if you feel kind of torn in two different directions. So I'll start off by asking, given how divided this nation is, when should you as a brand speak out, and when is it worth trying to stay above the fray? And has this potentially changed over time?
Great question. And like many of you, we've also noticed that there's more ways we could call it CEO activism or corporate activism now than there's probably been ever. I define corporate activism as when a company takes a public stand on a political issue that isn't, kind of directly related to their core operations. So companies for a long time have been engaged in, taking stands on issues that have a direct relevance to their business model. But if you look at recent issues, like Black Lives Matter, but also the Georgia voting law, or if you go back a few years when the North Carolina legislature issued a bathroom ban against transgendered people, a lot of companies spoke out. Even companies that were not located in those states spoke out. And so, yeah, we're definitely interested in why this is the case. Early research that we've been engaged in shows that the main reason for this kind of activism is that companies feel like this is something their employees want. That is, that their employees are calling for it, and the activist stands that companies are taking tend to resonate with their employees' political views. So it's not that CEOs are kind of political mavericks and using the company's platform as a way to promote their own causes. It rather seems to be that they're trying to use the company platform as a way to express the voices of their employees. Now, clearly not every employee thinks exactly the same way, but in many of these companies, there tends to be a stronger push from their employees to pursue these issues. Kind of resonates with something I heard at a conference not too long ago, where somebody in the audience asked a communications officer from a major Fortune 500 company when they take a stand on an issue. And the response was, we only take stands on issues that we think resonate with our core values. So when companies feel that it resonates with their employees' values, with their core values, they're more likely to say something. If it doesn't, they'll sit it out.
We're getting a lot of questions, perhaps this comes as no surprise to you, on the protests and counter-protests in response to the Georgia voting laws. I was wondering if you'd been following this and if you had any thoughts.
Yeah, well, I think so. Yes, this is a very important issue. And I think that, what you're seeing here is that many companies, across the country, around the world, are taking stands on this. And many of these are companies that I wouldn't have expected to take stands on this. I think the main reason for this is because freedom of expression and fairness, equity are core corporate values in most companies. That is, that when people join an organization, they believe that equity, fairness, is a value that they all share. And the way that this voting law has been portrayed by activist groups is that it is against those values, right? So if the voting laws are put in place to intentionally kind of make it difficult for certain groups of people to vote, that is not fair. It's not equitable. And so many of these companies are taking a stand because they believe it doesn't resonate with a core value that they all hold. There's another issue, though, I think, which I've thought about more in recent days, which is that many companies in the United States in particular have an investment in ensuring that democracy continues to function as it, in a stable way, kind of reversing course and going back to laws that were put in place, in the late 19th century to make it difficult for Black people to vote is definitely against the interests of companies that want to ensure that the United States is operating in a fully democratic, open way. And so I believe that another reason they're taking stands is because they feel like somebody has to step up to ensure that we don't see retrenchment on key democratic issues. And by democratic, I don't mean party, I mean democracy as a form of government.
We're getting a lot of questions about shareholder activism. Do you see this as an optimal way to move organizations toward change? Maybe you could start out by quickly explaining what shareholder activism is and then your take.
Yeah, great question. Shareholder activism is a kind of protest, I think, because in this case, it's just a different group of people protesting. The people who are protesting are some people who own enough shares in the company that they can submit a proposal or a resolution that is taken to the board to a vote. So, for example, if environmentally conscious investors are unhappy with the company's environmental practices, they can submit a shareholder resolution, asking the company to change its policies, and then they would try to get a coalition of other investors on board with them to support this. Most shareholder resolutions actually don't get enough support to constitute a majority. And this is true of socially or environmentally conscious resolutions, as well as like governance related resolutions. Most of these resolutions fail once they go to vote. However, companies don't like them for the same reason they don't like protests, because they create information that generates sort of unwanted attention to something the company would rather not have discussed in the media or by a broader group of stakeholders. And so often what companies will do is that they will say to the shareholder activists, withdraw your resolution and we'll talk with you about it. We'll engage with you in a conversation and figure out if we can find some way, to improve on these matters. And it turns out that increasingly, just as you see with protests, regular protests, boards of directors are willing to engage with socially, environmentally conscious shareholder activists as well. And one reason for this is because they are essentially becoming salient and creating a reputational threat that the board of directors would rather deal with internally rather than turn into kind of a public fiasco. And so we're finding that there's a rise in the extent to which they're effective means of change. And it's one of the main reasons why companies worry about risk. When there's a lot of shareholder activism around an issue, it tends to increase perceptions of risk, about what it could do to the company financially if the board doesn't do something about it. So yeah, very effective means.
This is an interesting question. I'm curious what you'll say. What should leaders of multinational companies be proactively prepared for? Where in these situations where people are protesting around a particular movement, but maybe not boycotting a specific company, or at least not their specific company. How can leaders be scanning for issues on the horizon that might affect them at any time throughout the globe, since obviously activism is not limited to here in the US?
Yeah, great question. It also points out there's a lot of political uncertainty as for multinationals, because they're dealing with so many different political and regulatory environments, and they have to be aware of all of them, in as much as they have investments in these different countries. And so that is one of the main reasons I think why companies have kind of shifted to making, activism, which used to be seen as a peripheral issue, to now making it a board level kind of function, where most multinationals now have some kind of CSR committee at the board level. It allows them to kind of like put it as a priority and make sure that they're proactively dealing with these issues rather than just kind of reactively dealing with these issues as they come up. And I know for sure that it's thought of more as strategically now rather than simply as kind of a PR issue. And so I think one of the main changes that have happened, especially for multinationals, is that you're moving, dealing with these kinds of political issues, you're moving it out of the communications offices and more under kind of core operation and strategy. The more volatile the political environment is for a company, the more likely they are to do that. Another change that's happened that has kind of shaped how companies deal with this is that ESG, for those of you who don't know what ESG is, it's kind of a series of metrics that third-party auditors use to assess how a company is doing on its social and environmental responsibility issues. E stands for environment, S stands for social, G stands for governance. ESG is sort of, in a way, kind of normalized how these issues are treated within the company. And most companies see it as an issue of compliance, even if it's not legal compliance, it's certainly kind of social compliance. And so you have a lot of lawyers and former nonprofit workers working internally in these companies to make sure that the companies are making a proactive effort to comply with the potential problems down the road.
Yeah, that really goes back to what you were saying earlier about how these kind of infrastructure changes might seem very minor and bureaucratic and kind of slow moving, but it sounds like they can actually be pretty substantial in terms of meaningful change.
Yeah, oh, for sure. 15, 20 years ago, there may have been one CSR officer at a company whose job was to kind of work with foundations to do charity work. Now, the larger the company is, the more likely you are to have like a whole unit that's kind of set up to deal with these issues. And if you're a multinational company with a lot of different national subsidiaries, you may have a different office, a different division within each country because of the complexity of the issues that you face.
You were chatting about ESG. We had a question. Do you think that companies that are focused on ESG or sustainability goals are better insulated against boycotts and crises?
It's a really good question. The short answer is I don't know, because we haven't done a kind of up-to-date study of this. That is that I think the environment has changed so much that it would be interesting to kind of see how that's affected companies these days. We did a study about how this changed during the 1990s and early 2000s. And what we found back then was that companies that were making efforts and making kind of stands on CSR issues, this is before ESG became a thing, those companies were actually more likely to get targeted, not less likely. And the assumption we made is because companies that made sort of public stands, but that weren't making real changes inside their company to kind of echo those commitments, public commitments, were actually creating a vulnerability for themselves to be called hypocrites. And so I think things have changed, and part of the change has been because there have been a lot more infrastructural changes in recent years. And so I don't know how that's evolved in like the last 10 years or so, but it sounds to me like a really good project to take on, and one that I'm certainly interested in looking at closely.
That's what I like to hear. We like these to turn into just a list of projects for you to take away, Brayden.
Me too.
We had a question about social media. How has social media changed how protests look? Has it changed their effectiveness?
So great question. And early on, I was sort of on the side of, like social media is being blown out of proportion. Like there was, during
never going to amount to anything, right?
Right. During the Arab Revolution, and a few of kind of those protest movements during the early days of Twitter and Facebook, there was a feeling in the activist world that this changes everything. That like now we don't need movement organizations. Now we don't need leaders. Everyone can organize on social media, and it'll be kind of more organic, more spontaneous, more flexible. And I kind of poo-pooed that and said, no, you still need people who are strategically kind of setting the agenda of the movement and And for example, if you want to target particular organizations, you have to have a more strategic mindset. I think though what's happened in reality is that kind of movement organizations have learned how to use social media really well. They've been able to take advantage of social media to expand the pie of activists. That is, that there are more people engaged in activism now because they can become more directly connected to activist groups and organizations. And the other thing that's changed is that it's given them a direct way to communicate with activists and allowed activists to communicate directly with one another as well. And so it has made them a lot more flexible, and you can see protests occur quickly overnight. As a movement sort of takes hold. We definitely saw that last year with the protests around Black Lives Matter following the George Floyd murders. That protests happened all over the United States and all around the world in different cities because people were coming together on social media, and organizations were activating those protesters via social media. So I think it's become a very effective communication mechanism. The other thing that it does is that it helps generate more media attention to their cause. Mm-hmm. So now they don't have to send out faxes to the New York Times to tell them where their protests are going to be. They can't, the New York Times journalists can follow them on Twitter, and when they can see these protests happening in real time. They don't have to show up there in person. They can follow the activist actions as they're being broadcast by cell phones and other devices, and then on Twitter and TikTok and other social media.
At least one person thinks that blockchain could maybe be the next tool to change how activism looks yet again. So I guess time will tell.
Yes, and another research project that I'd love to work with somebody on. So I think they're probably right. I don't know exactly how it would work, but it's certainly an interesting tool that will eventually be put to use for that purpose, I think.
Have you thought about what stage in a company's sort of life cycle it makes the most sense to kind of start engaging with activists? We had a question, someone who pointed out, in a really, early stage startup, for instance, you might not have the time or resources to do this in a smart way.
Yeah, I agree with that person in one way, which is that they just have more limited resources. When you don't have a lot of slack, it's hard to figure out, like, how do we prioritize this over, doing all the other things we need to do to keep our company afloat. On the other hand, I think that what a lot of startups are showing us is that they're building, social missions and purposes into their DNA at an early stage of company growth. And that's especially true, in the tech industry, but any industry that is kind of drawing on a younger generation of employees. We know from a lot of recent research that Generation Z and millennials kind of view their jobs differently than past generations. They put a lot of importance on the values of a company, and they're more likely to turn down sometimes better paying jobs because they want to work for a company that cares about the issues that they care about. And Gen Z and millennials also just tend to be a lot more politically active than maybe prior generations were. And so because of that, even though I think companies may not have as many resources to deal with these issues, there is some pressure on them to do it anyway, in as much as they depend on kind of a millennial Gen Z workforce that is going to be asking that of them.
I know that you have studied how Nike in particular has evolved over the years in terms of its relationship with activists. We had a question, can you think of an organization that has been able to meaningfully drive change through partnerships via internal champions? Or maybe that was the case in Nike as well. You tell us.
Well, I think what Nike did was they did it the hard way, but Nike was a leader as well, because there weren't a lot of athletic apparel or any apparel companies at the time that were doing any better than Nike. But Nike eventually changed because they not only listened to the activists, but then they began to bring the activists in and give them a real seat at the table. Now we kind of think of Nike as a company that is proactive in engaging on activist issues. It's become like a part of their brand, such that when Nike put up that billboard of Colin Kaepernick you know, at the time when Colin Kaepernick was still seen, you know, as a bit of a radical by many sports fans, you know, nobody was surprised because they thought, well, of course Nike will do this because Nike is a company that cares about racial justice, human rights, etc. So they were able to change their brand, but I don't think they could have done it without bringing in internal champions and, you know, making them a part of that process. I don't want to like highlight one particular company. I would just, I mean, there are easy ones, you know, to point to, like Patagonia or Ben and Jerry's, because I think everyone knows them as companies that, you know, the activist mission is directly tied to their strategic purpose. That is, it's hard to disentangle the two of those, and especially in Patagonia's case. But I think a lot of companies are, you know, looking at Patagonia and realizing, hey, this is no longer just a niche market. It's also a way that you can run a business. We can engage our employees on these issues and also make a profit and build a reputation that our customers like as well. So I see it becoming more and more common rather than just as kind of the niche strategy.
We are quickly running out of time here. For folks who are interested in just learning more about this topic, are there any books that you would recommend or resources that people could turn to?
Great question. This is all the more encouragement for me to finish my book, which will be hopefully out in a year or so. The book will be about protest and its impact on society and organizations. I would, you know, a book that's a few years old, but I would still encourage people who want to kind of get into the academic side of it, written by one of my co-authors. Sarah Soul wrote a book about protest and corporate social responsibility. You know, I will definitely work hard to get that book out because I want more people who are interested in this topic to kind of read about it from both a research, but also I think a more kind of general audience perspective.
That sounds wonderful. I can't wait to check it out. You know, I will be a very early reader. I want to thank everybody for attending today. I want to thank you for so many thoughtful questions, including ones we did not have time to get to today. And I especially want to thank you, Professor Brayden King. Really appreciated chatting with you. We are going to send out a video of this entire presentation to everybody. You will get it in the next day or so. And don't forget, next month, it's going to be a lot of Insightful Leader Live. We've got 2 webinars planned. Wednesday, May 12th at noon, we're going to hear about the American healthcare system. And on Thursday, May 20th at noon, we're going to hear about why people resist change and how to innovate anyway. So I will see you then. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.